Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. How good are your vendor email addresses in your vendor master file? Are they still valid? Are they fraudulent? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 384. Why you should add contact email validation to your vendor master file cleanup process. So many of you may have already taken my free training or maybe a webinar on my 8 steps to clean the vendor master file. For those of you that haven't, I'll have a link for it in the show notes. But it has been a while since I have added anything new to that 8-step process. The last thing that I added was the bank account ownership validation for those that have it, although that's really a one-by-one thing, but I did add it there in case there were any suspicions as you walk through that process and start analyzing vendor records. That is another thing that you can do to verify that, a fraudulent bank account hasn't, made its way into the vendor master file. So I did add that, but I hadn't added anything else, and I had definitely not added any contact information. And when I say contact information, I'm referring to the email address and actually phone numbers too, because it was a question that I received back in March of this year that kind of triggered the addition of the email address. And again, it was on the phone number, and the question came about from my subscriber because they said that my team recently asked whether there was a service, paid or unpaid, that they can use to verify or validate phone numbers. With so many people working remotely and using personal cell numbers, they are concerned about the increased risk of fraud. And that is actually very valid. I would be worried about that too. However, there are some benefits to not even taking phone calls. And I actually had that blog and podcast back in 2020 and 2021, right? And that was the best time for it because that was when everybody kind of went home. Fraudsters went crazy, phishing everyone because they knew it was a bit chaotic. And they called everyone too because they knew it was hard for anybody to validate because people weren't calling from their phones at work that had maybe an IVR that if you called from your desk phone, it would pick up and you would see that it would tell you that it's an internal phone number calling, and you could see who was calling. But back then, that was few and far between. Nowadays, you may have it, but I still advocate towards not even taking phone calls because it's hard to know who's on the other end. Now, if you do still take phone calls, I think the best way versus trying to validate every cell phone number, or every number that you call in, because those numbers can be spoofed, you don't really even know what number it's coming from. So I don't think that that is valid. I think the best way to do that is to ask authenticating questions if you do take phone calls to verify that the person on the other end is who they say they are. And so free training for authentication that does come with an authentication reference template. So you can customize it for your company, your team, and then make sure that everyone that has or responds to inquiries, whether it's phone or email, right? If there's any suspicions for email, actually, I think it should be done all the time, but all the time for phone. If emails are suspicious, you can ask those authenticating questions, and that training session will help you develop what the questions that you need for your vendors, your internal team members, so that you can verify they are who they say they are. So I'm going to go ahead and put a link to that free training in the show notes. So today, what I'm going to talk about is adding contact email validation to the vendor master file cleanup process because I think that is absolutely necessary. And I don't know why I didn't include it in the 8 steps to clean the vendor master file in the first place, because I do offer a vendor master file cleanup service where I'll ask you for specific information and then I'll take 10 days to validate your information, review it for duplicates. And part of that validating the information is validating that email addresses are good or bad. And so I've included it in there. So I don't know why I didn't add it to the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file, but I have added it now. So if you haven't taken that training, that free training, make sure you take it. And if you have taken it before, go ahead and check out the updated version that includes the vendor email address. Okay, so now let's get into why you should add contact email validations to your vendor master file cleanup process. And really, what I'm going to talk about or how I'm going to talk about it is in 1, 2, 3 different steps. So the first, or 3 different areas, I should say. So the first one is I'm going to talk about the different types of email addresses, what they are used for, and why they can change. And then the second one area I'm going to talk about is how to validate them. And then the third one is how to collect better email addresses, or how to collect the email address when you know that it is not good. So let's start with the different types of email addresses, what they are used for, and why they can change. So the first one, and this one was a big reason why I decided to add it, just because of the time of the year it is. You've just got done with tax reporting. If you're listening to this podcast when it comes out, April 23rd, 2026, right? So you just got done with tax reporting, which could have included, right, electronic delivery of recipient statements. And you know that the email address that you might have, sent that recipient statement 1099, 1042 with last year, may not have worked this year, but you didn't know that until you got like an undeliverable, whatever that error message is saying that it could not be delivered because the email is bad. And that could be, right, because the person that you sent it to has left the company or maybe moved to a different department. Maybe that company had a merger or acquisition, which can change the email domain. Again, this is a great time of year to talk about that because if you had that undeliverable right error message for the when you were trying to deliver the recipient statements electronically, you know, and it's probably fresh in your mind or your team's mind what they had to go through to find an updated email address or some a new contact to opt in to accept electronic delivery of the recipient statements, or you knew that you had to pivot and then send that recipient statement, physical recipient statement via mail. All right. The other type of email address is maybe a general AR email address. Now, this one can be used for requesting updated information following a cleanup process. And it can change because, again, of a merger or acquisition. It can change the email domain. It can also be changed because, you know, nowadays fraudsters will send an email to change contact information prior to sending a request to say update banking. And they do that because they know you're making that confirmation call. Dang, that's another reason why I probably should include the phone number in the validations as well. But anyway, fraudsters will send that email ahead of time, ask you to change the email address, change the phone number, right? Because if you make that confirmation call, um, or if you receive an email from the fraudster to change banking, but they've added that email, had you add the email to the vendor master file, to the vendor record, then you may assume that it is valid because the email address is on file. And so with that, right, that's another way that the fraudsters have evolved. And so that is a way that the, you know, general AR email address can change. Also, some companies, especially now, and I do advocate for it as well, if they have a customer database and a customer team maintaining that, you know, customer master file and a vendor master file, it can be better to combine those departments. You get to, you know, eliminate some segregation of duties issues, and you have, you know, one trained team on the master file management, data management. And so that may change the email address that you use for requests, for follow up, or other, you know, communication requirements to the vendor. And then, so the next type of email that you need is the email address that you use for remittances. Typically, that is a different email address. And, you know, just like the other ones, mergers or acquisitions can change that email domain. And sometimes, depending on where it goes, the change of a bank that is used for payments can change that remittance address as well. And then the last type of email address that you may have is the email address you use for automated, you know, purchase order delivery. And again, merger acquisition can change the email domain, which may change that address as well. Now, there could be different types of email addresses. This is just something to give you an idea of what you may be dealing with, or maybe your colleagues may be dealing with. or maybe that new job that you're getting, right? What they're dealing with. And so the different types of email addresses, what they're used for, and why they can change. And any email addresses or types I didn't talk about, some of these reasons why they can change, what they're used for, can be the same. All right, so let's now talk about now that you know they can change, if you add them or when you add them to your vendor master file cleanup process, you do need to have a way to validate them. Now, I'm not here to talk about any specific tools that you can use. I do want to say that what I do when I validate email addresses is I will use a third party provider tool and I will upload the email addresses in that tool in order to verify that the email addresses are still good. Again, because people can leave, and when they leave, that email address should no longer be good. And what I do is based on the results, I will label them good or bad. And if they are bad, then they do need to be removed from the vendor master file and replaced with a valid email address. And I do recommend that you have valid email addresses on your vendor master file because those can be used to follow up with your vendors in case there are any issues that you would like to confirm with them. Or just to use to compare to email addresses that you receive or emails that you receive, and you want to compare the email addresses in the email to the email address on file. And what do I mean by that? Well, I didn't come up with this. One of my subscribers did, and I actually love it. And one of the ways that she developed for her team to determine if a suspicious email may have been, had a spoofed email address. Now, nowadays, right, lazy fraudsters are the ones still using like the spoof email address, but it does happen. But the, not so lazy fraudsters are just in, the vendor's email, and you're not going to see any spoofing with that. But what she would do is she would have, she had an Excel formula that just had actually three cells. One was the cell where you copied and pasted, not typed, but copied and pasted the email address from the email itself. And then in another cell was the copied and pasted email address from the vendor master file, from the vendor record. And then the third cell was a formula just to say, do these match? And so if there's an extra letter, if it's been spoofed in any way that maybe you can't tell with the naked eye, the Excel formula will reveal that they are not a match. And so you can use it for that as well. Now, if the email, the person or the name is not the same in between the two email addresses, the one in the email and then the one on your vendor master file, then just do the same, only use the domain, everything after the asterisk, and then see if that could be, if that's a match. And if it's not, then that could be a red flag for fraud. So you can use it for that purpose as well. So you definitely want to make sure that for each vendor record, you have good email addresses. And some of your vendors, you'll have multiple email addresses. So if one is not good, let's say if someone left the company or moved to a different department, it may be okay if you still have, multiple one or multiple email addresses that are still valid. But how many times does that, happen in your vendor master file? Most times, is you do need to go and replace that email address with another one. And so the third part of this podcast episode is how to collect better email addresses. And let me just start. I've got 5 different ways that you can collect better email addresses. And the first one is, or I should say, 4 ways you can collect better email addresses and 1 way not to collect email addresses. Let's put it that way. And I'm going to start with the way that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has warned not to do. And I talked about this in episode 333 of this podcast, and it was called Looking for Vendor Contact Info. 3 reasons why the FTC warns not to use online search results. And so, one of the biggest reasons is that fraudsters, they have more funds, they have more time dedicated, they know how to get or how to use SEO to get their spoofed sites that with AI they could create in minutes now, but they know how to get those things to the top of the search results. And so that top search result may not be, right, your vendor's actual website. And so when you go to the website, it is, or it will have, the fraudulent, contact information for the fraudsters that you think is actually your vendors. And they also, excuse me, use paid ads as well to get to the top of the search results. There have also been reported instances where the fraudsters have stuffed their fraudulent contact information on actual sites. I've seen this happen with bank sites, or reportedly happening with bank sites, because they know that, folks will get the numbers for, let's say, the bank's fraud department, or their customer service department from their website. And so fraudsters can do that with vendor sites as well. And so trying to go to the web to get your uh, vendor's contact information is not good. And let's just say for a minute too that you actually do get to your vendor's actual sites. Well, some of the vendors, because they too are afraid of fraud and trying to avoid having their employees pre-texted, right? The AR team, those folks that you need to contact, they've actually taken their contact information off of the website. So, trying to find that information, even when you do get to the legitimate website of the vendor, is not that easy. So, let's talk about 4 ways that you can collect the vendor's contact information, including their email. And so I'm going to save the best one that I like for last, just because, that's just the way it's done. So the first way is the paid invoice. And so I specify a paid invoice because invoices today, as you know, can be fake. And so if you go to an invoice, a pending invoice, and take that information, contact information off that invoice, it could be a fraudulent invoice. What you need is to take a paid invoice that was actually recognized as a paid invoice from your vendor, meaning they removed it from their vendor statement. It was there the month before it was paid on that statement, and it was removed on the next statement that came through. And so you do need to make sure you do that research so you're getting an invoice, a paid invoice where the actual vendor received the payment. That invoice should not be forged or faked. And so you can get contact information from that invoice. Don't just take any old invoice, and definitely don't change banking or remittance address based on an invoice that is not paid and not recognized as paid by your vendor. I actually recommend though that for collecting any remittance information that you use a specific process that has internal controls, authentication techniques, best practices, vendor validations, which I talk about a lot on this podcast. All right, so paid invoice that was taken off of a vendor statement. So that's one way. The second way is if you have a purchasing or a PO vendor, right? You have a purchase order vendor. Um, Go to the buyer for that vendor and ask for the contact name that they have. It may not be the person you need to talk to, may not be the AR person, but you know what? They are a valid person at the vendor's place of business, and so they can give you that information. Now, the third way is for non-PO vendors. We all have them. And so you can go to, instead of to the buyer in purchasing, you can go to the internal team member that has a relationship with the vendor. Now, I always recommend, I should say, that you take the internal team member from the middle between you and the supplier or you and the vendor, because you don't want the internal team member collecting the documents that you use for vendor setup or changes, because those documents can include, right, sensitive information. W-9 can't have a social security number on it. And why have an internal team member, collect banking information just to give it to, your team, you or your team? Get it from the vendor directly. However, if you do not have any other way to, collect the vendor information, it's a non-PO vendor, then the internal team member is an option. All right, so this last one or last way to collect better email addresses or missing email addresses is using an internal request form. And this is the way that I actually prefer. It is like going to your buyer for a PO vendor or your internal team member for a non PO vendor. However, it differs because it is baked into your vendor process for vendor adds and changes. And so you would use this as part of a change process. And so I talked before about taking the internal team member, whether it's a buyer or, an internal team member for non-PO vendor, out of the middle between yourself and or your team and the actual vendor. The only way to do that is to collect the contact information for that vendor from the that internal team member, that buyer, that regular internal team member, and then use that information to contact the vendor in order to collect the information or the documents that you need. And so typically, if you have the internal team member in between you and the vendor for vendor adds and changes, then the internal team member is going to collect the W-9, they're going to collect the banking information, and then they're going to send that information to the vendor team to add a new vendor, to change an existing vendor. With this process, they would only uh, complete the internal request form, and that internal request form will include all the information that you need to contact the vendor. And this way, you're not getting the person that they deal with, right? You're not getting the salesperson. You're not getting, the person in, I don't know, whatever department that they're, purchasing the service or products from. You're going to get, or you should get, the AR folks. And if you don't get it, then you need to reach out to the internal team member and get it, or reach out to the contact that they gave you and ask who the best person is or department, what their email address, what their information is to collect that information. And so I like that as part of a process. And so when you need to collect better email addresses, then you can send that internal request form to the buyer, to the internal team member, and request that information. And that way you get all the information that you need. And that form doesn't need to be a big form. Typically, what I include on it is the vendor name, the vendor address, the vendor email address, and then whether or not, if they're using it for a vendor add or vendor change, you can even mark that all that information that is required for the form. Since you already know, you're just reaching out for a better email address or phone number too. You can use that for just complete the form and up until that point, and then send it to the internal team member so that they can fill in what you don't have, meaning that email address or right and or that phone number slot. And so that is how you can collect better email addresses. Definitely do not look that information up on the web, because again, according to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the fraudsters know that you look for that information online, and so they try to get their spoof sites um, uh, there at the top of the results. They try to get their fraudulent information stuffed into the vendor's real website, and so can't really trust that information when it's there. And if you do get to the real vendor's website, the vendors themselves may have taken down the contact information for the folks that you need to speak to anyway. All right, so I hope this provided some value to you, why you should add contact email validations to your vendor master file cleanup process. Talked about the different types of emails, what they're used for, why they can change, how to validate those email addresses, and then when those email addresses come back as bad, then how to collect better email addresses. And don't forget, that I am putting links in the show notes for the free training on 8 steps to clean the vendor master file. That's been updated with this contact email validation. Also, a link to the free training for authentication so that you know that you are speaking with or communicating with your internal team member, your vendor, and not a fraudster. And then if you do need help with vendor master file cleanup, I am going to put a link to my vendor master file cleanup service. So that's all I have for you today. I want to thank everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the 384th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.